everyone. In this video, I want to provide an introduction to using the Anaconda Python distribution to get started with Python programming for data science. Now, Python is a very popular and increasingly popular programming language for data science because it's so easy to get started with. It has a really wide array of different libraries and tools to support data science with Python. And it's really close to English. It's not so low level like C or assembly or C++. It's a little closer to English and kind of writes pretty well on the keyboard. So once you've downloaded and installed the Anaconda Python distribution, then you should be able to open this program called Anaconda Navigator. Once you've opened Anaconda Navigator, you're going to see a dashboard that looks something like this. So what you see here are a few common tools that are used to develop Python code for data science. Now, yours might look a little different than mine, and that's totally okay. As long as you just have some of the basics here, like Jupyter Lab, Notebook, and Qtconsole, you should be good to go. So I want to briefly talk about some of these tools and then show you two of them and how you can get started learning Python programming with these tools. So Jupyter Lab and Jupyter Notebook, these are two different development environments for designing and implementing Jupyter Notebooks. So what is a Jupyter Notebook? Well, I have an example of a Jupyter Notebook here. This is a Jupyter Notebook that I made a few years ago for a lab where students were just getting started learning to program in Python. So Jupyter Notebooks can combine really nicely formatted text. Like you see here, I have a header, paragraph text, mathematical formulas, typeset using LaTeX, links to external sites, some example output, formatted in kind of what looks like code with actual Python code. So let me scroll and you can see some examples of some Python code. So like right here, for example, I have a code cell. Okay, this right here is actual Python code that I can execute in the Jupyter Notebook, and you're going to see the output of the code right below it. And if there's any errors, as I purposely put one in here, then you'll see the error right below the output. So to summarize, a Jupyter Notebook is a really nice way to combine contextual text description of code with the code and its output together. It's really nice. Later, I'll have some videos and some lessons on getting started with Jupyter Notebook and why it's so popular for data science and data storytelling. All right, so these two right here are for working with Jupyter Notebooks. Jupyter Lab is a newer version of Jupyter Notebook. Qtconsole is used for interactive Python scripting, and I'm going to show you a demo of that. Spider is an example of an integrated development environment, or an IDE, that comes packaged with Anaconda Navigator. It's pretty simple and lightweight, and I have used it quite a bit in the past, but more recently I've been using VS Code, which is actually IDE, a really lightweight IDE from Microsoft. So VS stands for Visual Studio, and it's optional to install and not required or not kind of packaged out of the box with Anaconda. So if you haven't installed VS Code, I would encourage you to do so. And then I'll only point out maybe one more thing here, RStudio. R is another programming language that's increasingly popular for data science because it has a lot of statistical and plotting packages and it produces some really nice plots. This is, like I said, for the R programming language and not for Python programming. All right, so let's take some notes. All right, so first, I'm going to write ways to execute Python code. So we can write Python code, but we need it to execute on our computer to actually do something. So there are two main ways to execute Python code. So the first one is what's commonly called interactive mode. And I'm going to show you a demo of this. The second way is what's commonly called scripting mode. And I'm going to show you a demo of this as well. So let's start with interactive mode. So this would be executing Python in something called a terminal or a console, where as soon as you type a Python command and press enter, it's going to execute immediately. With scripting mode, you would use something like a file editor or an IDE, an integrated development environment, where you're going to be writing a lot of code and then running all of that code at once. So option number one, interactive mode, is common in data science when you are really just exploring a new library or want to quickly explore a new data set. And the code you're writing, it might be kind of throwaway code. It's just, you're quickly computing something or quickly making a plot, but you don't really, need that code to be executed, maybe days later. When you do have code that you maybe want to execute days later, you want to save it, then you would probably want to use option number two, scripting mode, and use like Spider or VS Code or just your favorite text editor to write some Python code and then use the Python interpreter to execute all of the code in that file. All right, so I really want to show you a demo of these two because I think it'll make a lot more sense. Those of you who are, coming maybe from a C++ or a Java background, you're used to option number two, scripting mode, where you write some code in a file and then you execute that file. What maybe is kind of different is option number one, interactive mode, but interactive mode is one of the great things about Python, and I think you'll really enjoy it. All right, so let's launch Qtconsole. We're going to use Qtconsole for our example of interactive Python. All right, I'm also going to launch my calculator on my Mac because I want to equate what we're about to do with the Qtconsole program, which is really just an interactive interface to Python, to what you might use a calculator for. So let's say you need to quickly crunch some numbers in your calculator, right? Maybe you're like, oh, I don't really know what, I'll just make something up, 8 times 15 is. It's 120. Okay, I'm probably not going to need to calculate that number again because I'm going to use the result 120 immediately and maybe put it in my spreadsheet or put it in my notes. Okay, that's kind of what I mean when I say when we use interactive Python, we just need to quickly explore something. It's kind of a throwaway operation we're going to do. We just need the result for something and then we're going to move on. We don't need to save that actual, 8 times 15. So let's head over to Qtconsole and let's treat interactive Python just like a calculator. So I can actually type 8 times 15 and press enter. As soon as I press enter, Python's going to try and execute what I just typed as valid Python code. If I didn't actually write valid Python code, then I would get some sort of error. Like maybe I did 8 and then I wrote times 15 and I tried to execute that. Well, that's not valid Python code, so I actually get a syntax error saying something's wrong with the syntax. Now, your calculator doesn't really have something, quite like the syntax error because it has a very limited interface, right? Like I can only press these buttons. Now, the interface, though, to working with interactive Python is much more generic, right? I can type free-form text and attempt to execute it as Python code. So the calculator serves a very specific purpose, but Python is more general purpose, right? I can do more than just execute some numbers with Python because I can type letters and words and all sorts of fun commands. All right, let's try another example in our calculator. Okay, let's say we're going to clear this and I want to do 100 minus 92. I'm just making up numbers. All right, that's 8. And then I want to multiply 8 by 5. That's 40. All right, do you see how I just did a kind of string of commands? Well, I can do the same thing in Python. 100 minus 92, enter, 8 times 40. Or excuse me, I think I did 8 times 5. 8 times 5 is 40. Now, I could do this all in one statement, but I need to make sure that I apply my PEMDAS rules, right? Parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. Do you remember that kind of PEMDAS acronym from elementary school? All right, well, it's really important. So I can do 100 minus 92 first by putting it in parentheses, and then I can take that result and multiply it by 5. And I get 40 as well. So you could already start to see how this is more powerful than your calculator because I can string together and make really, really large expressions. And these expressions don't have to contain just these simple numbers I have here. Like I can, for example, store this result in a variable called result. And now I can access result later. Some of you might have done this on a more advanced calculator than the one I'm showing here. Like, for example, graphing calculators or financial calculators, they usually have little variables that you can store values in, like the STO functionality, like stored in slot 1, slot 2, and then you can go retrieve it from slot 1 or slot 2. This is the same thing, but Python is much more powerful because I don't have to just store numbers. Like a calculator, I can actually store words. So maybe I'm going to store name is assigned or stores with this equal sign here, Python. And I have to put Python in double quotes. And now I can access what I stored in the variable called name. All right, so this is just my brief overview of working with Python interactively. There's so much more. This is just scratching the surface. I just wanted to kind of get you started. Like for example, you can start playing around with name now, right? Like what happens if I do name times 2? I get 2 Pythons. What? That's so strange, right? Like this is way more powerful than a simple calculator. What happens if I do maybe name dot upper? I can get an uppercase version of Python. Or if I type len and type in name, I can get the number of characters, the length of name. There's just so much more you can do here. This is a full-blown programming language where you can program your computer to do lots of really cool things. All right, so that's my overview of Qtconsole, interactive Python. You type a Python statement, you press enter, and you immediately try and execute it. All right, next, I want to move on to a demo of scripting mode. So using an editor or an IDE, integrated development environment. So what I want to use for my IDE is going to be VS Code, Visual Studio Code. So you can install it or you can launch it from here. I already had it installed before I installed Anaconda Navigator, so I'm just going to launch it directly. All right, so this is a program called Visual Studio Code where you can edit Python files, and once you're done editing a Python file or a set of Python files, you can run all of the code in them from top to bottom. So instead of running one Python command at a time, you're going to run one at a time, but rapidly sequentially. All right, so let's head over to the Explorer in the sidebar here. And it says you have not opened a folder. Well, let's open a folder. So let's make a new folder. I'm going to call this, let's call this Python Basics Fun. And now VS Code is only showing me Python Basics Fun, the folder, and its contents. Well, I just made this folder, so there's no contents or files or subfolders in it, but that's okay. We can quickly create one. So still over here in your Explorer, your File Explorer, you're going to click this new file icon, and let's call the new file hello_world.py. And make sure you type this exactly as I've typed it. The most important part is that .py at the end. So this is a file extension, .py. You've probably seen other file extensions before, like .docx. That's a Microsoft Word document extension. .txt, that's just a plain text file. .mp3, that's a music file. So these extensions here are used by your operating system like Windows or Mac, or used by programs like VS Code or Microsoft Word to figure out what kind of file are they working with. So when we name a file .py, we are telling the world, so to speak, we're telling our machine, all of our programs, the operating system, VS Code, etc., that this file is a Python file. It is going to store Python commands, Python expressions. All right, so this is just a text editor now we have open. And I can type anything I want. You know, here's a sentence. Right, I can type anything I want, but because this is a .py file, a Python file, and VS Code is used for programming and coding, it's going to try and interpret this code as Python code and tell us if we ever type some code that's not valid Python code. And none of this is valid Python code, hence all of the squiggles, the red and the orange squiggles. So I'm going to delete that, and instead I'm going to write some code just like I wrote over here. So I know this is valid Python code because it executed in Qtconsole. So result is assigned 100 minus 92 times 5. And now I'm going to explicitly tell the Python interpreter, print this result. Now, when you're ready to execute this Python file, you actually have to tell VS Code, execute this Python file, right? Before, every time I pressed enter, it was executing the line I just written. That was interactive Python. This is scripting Python, where it's not executing every time I press enter. It's only going to execute when I explicitly say, run this file. And it's going to execute all of this code from top to bottom. So let's save the file and head over to the upper right of VS Code where there's this green kind of play button. It says run Python file in terminal. Okay, that sounds familiar, right? Remember in our notes, we were talking about how we can execute Python interactive mode in the terminal or scripting mode in the editor or IDE. So now we need to execute our code that we wrote in our editor via a terminal like we were doing with interactive Python. So let's click this button and we're going to see a terminal pop up that looks kind of familiar to our Qtconsole where we were executing Python code. So here's our output right here, 40. And that's what we got when we executed it in interactive mode. All right, let's try doing a little bit more in scripting mode. Okay, so remember, in scripting mode, I just have this text editor, and I'm going to be able to write any Python code, save it, and then run it in a terminal, just like I was running directly in a terminal with Qtconsole, but it's going to run the entire file from top to bottom instead of a single line at a time. Okay, so let's just do another, what did I have over here? Name is Python. Okay, let's do IDE, Integrated Development Environment is VS Code. I'm going to print IDE, and I'm going to also try printing IDE.upper. All right, I see VS Code printed and then VS Code in all uppercase. One more thing I want to show you in this video before we conclude is something that's really nice about working in scripting mode is you can put in comments in your code so that later when you open this file, you'll be able to kind of remember what you did or why you did something. Or if you're looking at somebody else's code, maybe another programmer, you'll be able to read their comments and it will document what they did. So if you ever have a single pound sign or single hashtag, anything on the rest of that line in scripting mode is going to be ignored. So I'm going to write, this is a one-line comment. Anything after the pound sign on this line will be ignored by Python. And what do I mean by ignored? Meaning I can type random stuff here that isn't valid Python code, right? I know that's not valid Python code because VS Code is telling me there's something wrong here. And it will be ignored. So that's where we can just kind of write our free-form English sentences. So this is really nice to document your code. Like, for example, at the top of this file, I might write a little reminder. Python executes code from top to bottom in this file. Okay, so this line of code is going to be executed before this line of code. All right, well, that is my introduction to getting started with some of the tools that come with Anaconda Python Distribution and the two different ways that you can execute Python code. Interactive mode, you're in a terminal, you write a line of code, and it immediately executes that line of code. Scripting mode, you're in an editor or an integrated development environment like VS Code, and you're writing a lot of Python lines in this file. You save the file, and then you run all of those lines of code at once. The output from running that code is going to be in a terminal, but it's not going to be an interactive terminal. It's just going to be an output terminal like we see here. All right, thank you for watching.